Tom Campbell here. If you find something of significant value in our videos, please consider supporting their production through our Patreon account or through a one-time donation. The links are in the description below. Thank you and enjoy the video.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 81st Fireside Chat. Today we're going to start our questions with Victor.
Hi, Tom. So I have a question for you about suicide in NPMR. So suppose that an IUOC wants to disappear just completely. Maybe they think that the growing up is too hard, and maybe this done reality doesn't change their mind. So you said in another video that there is probably no self-delete button for IUOCs. So my question is, what's basically the maximum damage that an IUOC could do to itself or to the LCS if it either makes the worst possible choices constantly, or maybe it strongly wishes to disappear using a being level intent? And the bonus question is, have you met any IUOCs that actually tried to do this?
No, I have never met any IUC who has actually tried to do this. I think it's it's an interesting question, but it's one that's entirely hypothetical as far as as far as my experience goes. It's not something that is realistic. IUOCs might feel that way for a very short period of time. People feel that way for a very short period of time, where they call that the dark night of the soul, I think, where you feel like there just is, no hope. There is no place to go, that you've reached the end and there's nothing else, and so on. So that, no doubt, is a feeling that some people get, maybe even a whole lot of people get, now and again. But that generally doesn't last. When you go up to the IUOC level, you're talking about something that goes on forever, if you will. You're talking about something that's immortal. So little spates of depression or desperation are generally just tiny little blips on a otherwise not so bad, existence. Existence isn't all that awful. We just tend to think sometimes that it's awful when we get wadded up in the little picture and can't see the big picture. There's almost no reason whatsoever to find life as awful unless you're stuck in a little picture. Once you see the big picture and you see what you're a part of and what's going on and so on, it's really hard to maintain that kind of a negative attitude, if not impossible. So I think that happens in the little picture, yes, and maybe even frequently. But in the big picture, I'd say that would be an extremely low probability that any entity would get in that kind of a feeling once they're in the big picture and not in the little picture. Those kind of feelings, will come and go, but they're not really big picture thoughts. They're little picture thoughts. Everything's awful now. It's not that everything's awful, period. It isn't. The way it is, period, is wonderful. It's great. There's opportunities. It's fun. There's challenges. So it's all very positive in the big picture. In the little picture, everything may seem to be awful now, but it just doesn't stay that way. So what would be the worst thing that could happen if an IUOC said, please delete me, Please, I really want to be deleted. Can't you just delete me, LCS? I'm done here. The LCS would probably roll its eyes and ignore that plea, because it would know that it was just said out of ignorance, basically. It was just said out of a little picture trap. So it's not going to say, well, okay, if that's what you want. That's very unlikely to happen too, for the very same reason. That's a temporary kind of a feeling. And if it just decided that it was going to do the most damage possible and just be as negative and high entropy raising as possible, even that is self-defeating, because as you do that, you just make yourself more and more miserable. So if you're in this mode of making yourself miserable, and then you decide that, well, what I'm going to do is make myself even more miserable, and then after that you decide, well, I'm going to make myself even more miserable than that, I think there's an end to that. I don't think that goes on forever. I think any entity would get to a certain point and say, I think I'm moving in the wrong direction. Let's make this less miserable, not more miserable. So I don't think that is really a sustainable possibility that an IUOC could do that. So interesting question, just to kind of pick at the kind of outer boundaries of things that are possible. Never been asked that before, so I'm always happy to get questions that I haven't answered before.
Sure.
But anyway, I don't think it's something that would happen, even 1 in a trillion times. It's just anything's possible, but I think that is extremely unlikely that you'd have that problem. Eventually, the IUOC is going to turn around and not want to make itself more miserable. Eventually, the IUOC will get out of its little picture and into the big picture, where really in the big picture, there's really nothing going on but love. That's a hard thing to want to run away from. That's something that even if you feel small, it still feels good. So it's kind of unthinkable that would happen.
I see. Very nice. It actually seems like the IUOC level and the PMR little picture is kind of totally different views.
Yes,
at the IUOC level, you see everything, but in PMR, you might or might not get stuck in little pictures.
That is true. Completely different pictures altogether. Once you have that big picture, all of the little stuff that you find aggravating and upsetting and negative, it just disappears. It just doesn't exist there. All of that has to do with fear, ego, and belief inside a little picture.
So you're saying that it's not even having to do with PMR itself, but more like, like you said, the fear, ego, belief kind of things, right?
Yes, it's having.
I see.
You see, it's the fear. Now, the fear, is part of your consciousness. That fear doesn't go with the virtual reality. That fear is a part of you. But the reason that you feel negative and unhappy is not just because you have fear. It's not like I have fear and that makes me unhappy. You just are who you are. But when you're in this little picture and you have fear, that fear interacts with other people and their fear. And that's what makes you unhappy. So it's the interaction with others. It's the interaction in this virtual reality that then seems to be so horrible and so negative, and that people would like to escape. But once they're out of this virtual reality, then all those interactions stop. You don't have any of that anymore. There isn't anybody calling you names or putting you down or stepping on your foot or spitting in your face, or all the other things that annoy you and upset you don't exist anymore. But you
regardless of the quality, right?
Yeah, but you still have the fear you have, and you still have that ego that you have, because that's part of your consciousness. But there isn't anything to trigger it. There's nothing that makes it make you feel bad. It's just you and the way you are, you see? So if there's nothing if there's nothing that is twanging that fear, then it's almost as if you didn't have the fear. You don't notice it, which was the big problem to begin with, is why they needed the virtual reality, because there were lots of entities out there that just weren't growing up much. They had whatever fear or ego or beliefs they had, and so what? There weren't any consequences. So it was hard to evolve. So this reality that we have now, this virtual reality, has this tight rule set so that everything we do interacts with other things. We're not an island all to ourselves like we were in the big chat room, where you can do anything and it doesn't really matter that much. Now we're all connected. So I do something that affects people around me, and they get the effect of what I do, and it affects the people who are around them. And the things that people around me do affects me. And we have this really tight coupled rule set that lets everything affect everything else. And that's where the fear and the ego and the beliefs start to interact with each other. And my fear and your fear interacting with each other get us angry. You see, and get us upset and make us feel bad. And now we don't like being here because it's full of anger and upset and feeling bad. But you see, that's how it works. So once you leave here, that's gone. Yes, you still have your fear and you still have your ego, but there's no negativity really associated with it, or very little negativity associated with it, I should say, because it's not so interactive. You get back into the virtual reality, and that's very interactive. And now, in that interactive space, if you can get rid of your fear, then you can find joy and happiness and peace and tranquility in that small reality, in that virtual reality, because you've grown up, you've evolved, your quality of consciousness has gotten higher. You're not triggered to get angry by other people. You see, so that's kind of the way it is. That's why, the basic question is really a little picture, being projected onto the big picture, and that's not the way it is. It doesn't work that way.
I see. It almost sounds like anybody who's about to commit suicide in PMR could get an experience from the LCS. Hey, let's go back to the IOC for just a moment, and maybe they would see things differently.
If they could get that bigger picture, but you see, the whole point of that describes depression is that your picture gets smaller and smaller and smaller. That's what depression really amounts to. When you're happy and full of joy, you have this big decision space and your world is wide open. It's huge. It kind of contains everybody. And then as you get depressed, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And pretty soon there's nothing in your reality except you and your pain. That's it. Everything else is kind of outside of your reality. Even your friends, your parents, your children, whatever else that you might think you should be connected with, they're all pushed out. It's just you and your pain, and that's all that's there. So the whole point is your reality shrinks and shrinks and shrinks to where it's tiny, and there's nothing in it except misery. And then that's where people get suicidal. So, see, they're moving in just the opposite direction from seeing the bigger picture. Their picture's smaller and smaller. And when they're in that tiny little picture, they tend to refuse to look at any bigger picture. If someone's very depressed, you can come up and say, well, George, there's a lot of people that care about you. I care about you. I know your parents care about you, and, your brother and sister, they care about you. And there's people at work that, really appreciate you too, and they care about you. And the depressed person goes, yeah, not really. They put up with me or whatever, but yeah, it's all bad, and they refuse to see it. Even though there are people in their life that care about them and love them, and there's this positive stuff there that's potential, they refuse to acknowledge it. They refuse to accept that it's like that because they're in such a tiny little reality. So somehow the system saying, hey, let's take a bigger picture isn't going to work very well, because that person that's depressed is going to reject it. They're going to deny it. Yeah, well, they don't really like me that much. It's just because I'm, a relative, or I'm their son, or I'm their husband or wife or something. That's all. They just put up with me, and they don't, they just can't accept anything positive at that point. So that's where suicide comes from. It's a tiny little picture. But once that person dies, then suddenly it's, oh, all right, everything's different now. See, all that little picture kind of disappears. That was just in that lifetime. So now they get to start another one. The only downside, or I shouldn't say that, but the major downside in suicide is that anything you do once, it's easier to do it again. When you do something for the first time, there's a little bit of barrier there because it's the first time. But once you break down those barriers and you've done it once or done it twice, then it's much easier to do it again. So that's kind of the downside to suicide, is that once you've done that once, now next time you get in a jam and everything seems, terrible, and you've kind of hit this sad place, instead of bouncing back, it's easier to just say, well, I'll just end it. And after you've committed suicide 5 or 6 times, then that becomes the choice. Oh, things aren't going so good today. Maybe I should just end it. You see? Well, now you've become a very fragile person. And if everything isn't going just right, well, you're ready to commit suicide. So that's not a good space to be in. That then takes you time to work that back out. Eventually, the system will put you in a very simple incarnation where everything stays pretty calm. There's not a lot of hard choices, to give you a more positive attitude, and then build it up the next time, a little more positive attitude, and you will eventually work yourself out of that. But that's probably the major downside of suicide. It just makes suicide an easier thing to do next time. Whereas if you tough it out and say, well, okay, dark night of the soul now, how can I change this? What can I change? What can I change about me? I can't change the world, but what about the way I see the world? Can I just accept that it's that way and let that be okay? Let everybody be how they are, and just find my place in it. If you can do that, then a lot of people get that dark night of the soul, but then they come back from it. And matter of fact, most of them, when they come back from it, will tell you that was the greatest thing that ever happened to them, because suddenly they got a whole new perspective on life and what it was about. And instead of being so wound up in self-pity that they can't see anything else, they start seeing a little bigger picture. And then that big picture can expand. So that's the thing. You want to keep going. You don't want to throw away the investment that you've put in a lifetime so far. And fact is, it's hardly ever as bad as it seems. So that's I guess that's kind of suicide in a nutshell. It's a problem of people getting smaller and smaller realities and getting more and more self-centered. It's self-pity. It's all about you. You kind of reject everything outside of you, and everything is just about you. So it's the ultimate self-pity, self-centeredness, and tiny, tiny reality all conspire to take people to suicide. It's unfortunate, because then they waste all the investment they had, up to this time. And coming back from that kind of a place often turns out to be a big step forward, because you've gotten there and you've come back from it. And you can see things differently. You get a different perspective. So in a way, you could think somebody that's contemplating suicide is kind of on the cusp of making a big step forward, of growing up, if they could just grab that opportunity, because they're in such a position that the kind of the comparison, the counterpoint between little reality and bigger reality is just so obvious when you're there, if you can see it.
Thank you, Tom.
Mm-hmm.
Very enlightening points.
Luis, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Donna. Hi, Tom. Hi, everybody. It's always a pleasure and a great opportunity to be here. So, Tom, I want to help you navigate my question because I did 2 updates. I'm going to read the first part of the first update, and then I'm going to read the second update. So the first part of my question will be, you know the feeling, I know, but I can't tell you how I know it. I just know it. You've spoken about the difference between experience and intuition. The second one being getting data from the database without a logical process in terms of shared reality, mediating such data retrieval. The first part of my question will be, like you, I'm interested in promoting a big picture through scientific language. But science is all about facts, that is empiric evidence, direct or inferred, but it has to come to grips at some point with something observable. How to reconcile or express intuitive knowledge through scientific language and its evidence-based argumentative logic. Is there a limit to which we can express through human language, or there's always a handy metaphor for everything?
Well, there's usually a handy metaphor for everything, but it's just whether or not that metaphor is helpful to, how many people. Yes, there's these 2 different ways that your consciousness processes information. One's intellectually, one's intuitively. And the intellectual is the logical, objective side. And then the intuitive is not. The intuitive is not rational. It's not logical. It just is the way it is. Yes, you just know something without any process to having gotten there to know it. And those 2 sides are not incompatible in any way. They work together wonderfully. Matter of fact, they're extremely compatible in that sense, that they work together perfectly. One fills in where the other one leaves off. They each have a strength where the other one has a weakness. So they're a perfect pair to work with. But when it comes to the science of the subjective, okay, now I would claim that MBT is a science of the subjective, but it's not a science of the, science of the subjective isn't making the subjective objective. That doesn't work. You can't make the subjective objective. But what you can do is make the subjective understandable. You can create a model or a structure in which it's understandable. You can make the subjective accurate by developing, the skills required to work in subjective space. You can make the subjective reliable. So you can make it accurate, you can make it reliable, okay? And you can turn it into experience, into objective experience, as far as that knowledge that you just get without any logic behind it needs to be useful. And it needs to be useful in a larger sense. It's not, subjective knowledge isn't just useful in the subjective world. Subjective knowledge is just knowledge. It's useful, period. So if that subjective knowledge helps you function well in the objective world, well, now that is some verification of its realness, of its value. So if you learn things in that subjective world and then those things work for you, helpful, they make you understand things in the objective world more fully, They help you understand things more fully. So, you can do a remote viewing, and if you can get accurate and reliable with it, then you can use it to tell whether or not a car is going to if you're parked. Here's what happens to me. I park my car, and there's a truck on either side of me, or a big van or something on either side of me. Now I have to back out of that parking space, and I can't see anything but a side of a truck on this side and a side of a truck on that side, and I'm in the driver's seat, so at least 2/3 of my car is going to be stuck out into traffic before I get my first opportunity to look at it. But I can remote view it, you see? So things that you have in the intuitive space can be important and interact nicely in the objective space, in which case you really stop separating them so much, and they're just different ways of dealing with information, and it all just becomes one thing. You don't go to the subjective and go to the objective. You just get all that information. It's yours, and you action on it. You make choices based on it. So it just becomes a whole thing like that. So I think that a science of the subjective is basically a structure that lets you understand how it works. Why is it that you are angry? Being angry is subjective. That's not an objective thing. So why are you angry? Well, if you have a science of the subjective, it should tell you that. Well, it's because you've got fear. And because that fear, is a tool of that fear is your ego and the belief. And that stuff makes you angry because you start interpreting things as everything's self-referential. It's all about you. Oh no, that person said something bad about me. That makes me angry. Well, it only makes you angry because you have a fear somewhere that says it might be true. And that's what makes you angry. You see? So once you understand a structure that explains it, then I think that's as far as you're going to get as a science of the subjective. You're not going to, get your subjective microscope and look at a piece of subjective something and tag it and see how much it weighs, because it's not like that. You're just never going to make the subjective objective. It's just different. But that doesn't mean that you can't understand it. It doesn't mean you can't use it. Doesn't mean you can't develop it. And eventually, the subjective will become, a very large and important and significant part of your everyday life. Not just something you do when you meditate. It'll become a part of your life. And at that point, there's really not much differentiation between it, because you just automatically mix those two together in whatever way is appropriate. Your subjective gives you this information, your objective does that logic on that information, and they just kind of play together in a way that you don't even notice the boundary between them. So I think, yes, there is a science of the subjective. And I think MBT offers probably the only one that I know of. I don't know that there's any other model of the subjective other than this one. But it does explain everything subjective. And from my experience, once you're more balanced between the two, you basically live your life more out of the subjective than you do out of the objective. The subjective becomes kind of your fundamental base reality, actually, and the objective is there because that's the virtual reality you're in. You have to deal with all those things that seem to be objective, and you deal with them as intelligently and cleverly as you can. But that's not where the real meaning in your life comes from. The real meaning and significance in your life isn't by rearranging the objects. It's by dealing with the relationships. That's all subjective, and that's where the growth comes from, and that's where your conscious evolution comes from. So that becomes kind of the main, the main thing on the screen. And the objective part is something you have to work in. I mean, I'm a physicist. I make my living, by doing objective things, in the objective world. And that was fine. I enjoyed that. I had fun with it. It's a fun thing for me to do. But it's not the main thing going on, in my existence. It's just another place that I can work and work effectively. So it actually turns out that the subjective world becomes more of your fundamental world, because what is subjectivity? It's your mental life, right? And emotional life. That's that's where the rubber meets the road in experience. So that kind of brings us to the point that we can see how limiting it is for people who never develop that subjective side and only live in the objective side. They live out of their intellects. They live out of their heads on the intellectual side, and they never touch the other side. Well, they're living not just half of an existence, but they're maybe living only a third of an existence. The richness to life mostly all falls over on the subjective side.
It's really interesting how when you think of science, as you were saying, as a way to promote a big picture, it really wraps everything up, because then you're not just looking for the essences or the ultimate cause of things, but you're kind of more towards helping and giving people a big picture. So as you were saying, you realize it's just tools to communicate a bigger picture and the subjective part of the human experience. So can I make the second part of my question?
Sure.
Thank you. So the second part, which is the last update, it has to do with will you get rid of fear and ego just by making choices about others? Today, you see forms of existential anxiety like the infamous FOMO, which is a fear of missing out, which is the fear of not being part of the trends and mainstream of the social media. I could add also playing with acronyms, GIROAFA, which will be getting it right once and for all. This is a more common anxiety within spiritual practices and so-called progressive paths, based on merit and time spent on the cushion or on your mantra. These anxieties stem from the fact that you believe that you are your avatar, and either you take your chance making it this time or else it will be too late. Anyway, but can you be a low entropy person without ever realizing there's a big picture? You could be a very strong person full of fear and ego driven thoughts and still making sort of the right choices, by pushing your fears down and just ignoring those ego driven thoughts, the ones that benefit the collective instead of your own interests, putting yourself aside while working for the happiness of others. But I'm not sure if this will make your fears or ego less of a problem. So again, what would you tell me on the topic of lowering entropy if I say I will set my intent to always make it about other, to make good choices, but I will never have any sort of a spiritual or big picture practice?
Well, that's complex, but we can unravel it. So yes, your fear of missing out or needing to get it right, those things are things that are because you have fear. You have fear of not being adequate. So you really need to feel that, you're a part of what's happening. You're accepted by the group, that the group looks at you and says, you're okay. That's so important to you because you've got a fear that you're not really very much and maybe you're not okay. So you're driven to get this validation, if you will, from others. because you don't have the validation from yourself. So that's what's going on there. And the same thing, if you have to get it right, you're really driven to get the right answer, it's because you fear that you won't get the right answer. You'll get the wrong answer, and that will be a problem. So see, both those are just things of fear. And because you have those fears, then you have these needs. The needs are born of the fear, a need to get it right, a fear to not miss out, to be part of the happening scene, to be liked, to have a lot of friends who like you, because all of that validates that you're okay. And it would be better if inside you, at your being level, you just felt that you were okay. You had confidence that you were okay. Then you wouldn't need to be validated from the outside because you're validated from the inside. So it's better to grow and be validated from the inside. If you're not, then, plan B, the way you deal with that lack of confidence and validation from the inside is to try to get it from the outside. Of course, when you get it from the outside, you never actually believe it because it's not real, until you get it to the inside, you see? So there you are, and you're pretending, oh, everybody likes me. I'm the hit of the party, and I have lots and lots of friends, and I seem to get the right answers, and you still feel bad inside. You still don't feel confident. You see, so what it does is that you're chasing the confidence. You're trying to get it from the outside in, and it doesn't work because somewhere in a deep level, you just know you're not all that worthy. You see, you're not all that confident. So no matter how many people slap you on the back and call you friend and think that you're wonderful, at a deeper level, you're not. So that's the problem, and you don't grow up then. So you're constantly trying to kind of whitewash over your fear by being very social and connected and getting right answers. And then what happens, it starts to get important to you that you get the right answer. Important to you that people like you. Now somebody says, well, Lewis, that's not the right answer. And instead of you saying, oh, why? You get angry. What do you mean that's not the right answer? You see, it makes you angry now because they've just twanged your fear. You see how that works? So that's the point. You can't just be kind of happy faking it. Because when you're faking it, you get angry, you get upset when people point out that you're faking it, or when people, kind of trigger that thing that you're trying to get from outside. So you want people to like you. Now somebody slights you and they don't like you. Well, now it's a big problem. You get upset about that. It hurts your feelings. You see, the reason it hurts your feelings is because they're not giving you the validation that you need. And of course, you don't see it that way. In your own mind, they just said something rude and you're upset, you're angry. Well, the reason you're angry is because you don't feel validated from the inside. You're trying to get the validation from the outside, and that person's giving you negative validation. They're tearing up your validation. And your response to that is one of negativity, and that comes out then as anger. So the idea of going through life with a lot of fear and ego and beliefs, but doing the right thing is really, really hard to do, because having that fear and belief and ego, what that does is makes you angry and you get upset and you get annoyed. Well, all right, maybe you learn how to swallow that down. That makes you really angry, but instead you smile. A fake smile, yes, but a smile all the same. And then you walk away and go, bang your head against the wall or beat yourself up or do something else later. And then when you get over it, you walk back out in polite society again. All that just gets worse. It doesn't get better. because now somebody just triggered your fear. You got angry. Now you're even more sensitive about having your fear triggered. Now somebody else says something that wasn't nearly as bad as what that first person says, but you're triggered almost as much because you're looking for that bad news. You're looking for that trigger now. You're sensitive to it, you see? So if you have the fear and the ego and the beliefs, they are just going to lead you into a space where you're unhappy, because inside is where that unhappiness is. And yes, you can paste it over to some extent, but the more you spend your life with an image rather than yourself, the more you're not authentic, and you smile when you're really angry and you do other things, that starts to build up. And it builds up, and maybe you can do that for a while, but most people can't do that forever. They get to the point where they explode. They get to the point they just can't take it anymore, and then they're off the rails for a while. And then, maybe a month after, being in the depression and off the rails, and who knows what they do. Sometimes they turn to alcohol or do other things like that, to self-medicate. Okay. Then maybe they get themselves to where they can pretend a little more, but then they go off the rails, and pretty soon going off the rails happens every other week. And then every week. You see, it just builds up. You can't sweep the dirt under the rug and not notice it. Well, in the beginning you can, because it's just a little bit of dirt. You can sweep that dirt under there and the rug still looks like it's lying flat and there isn't any problem. And we can all go on and, rug's perfectly fine. But eventually there's this big lump under the rug, and it starts to show. And everybody notices, and you notice. And it no longer is a good place to hide the dirt, because it's showing, underneath that rug. So that's the problem with that. That's the problem. If you try to fake it instead of actually being kind and loving and caring, you just try to do the right thing intellectually, you're going to end up bitter and unhappy, because you'll have a lifetime of pretending. And because you haven't gotten rid of that fear, you'll blame that lifetime of pretending on everybody else. The world sucks. Everybody sucks, and you'll just have this negative attitude toward everything. And at that point, people will walk around you and avoid you because you're not nice to be around. So we know people like that, people who are older and they're bitter. They're not happy. Oh, they suck it up and soldier on for the most part, but they're not really very happy people. You see, so that's the problem with just faking it. It doesn't really work. Eventually, you have to pay the price. So it's better to just be authentic. All right, authentic me may have some rough edges. It may have some problems, but at least it's me. And then start working to smooth those edges down. Actually smooth them down. Not pretend they're smoothed down. Not act like they're smoothed down, but to actually smooth them down. Now you're making progress, you see? So that's why you can't really make progress until first you get authentic. Because until you get authentic, there's really nothing to work on. You can't change yourself if you don't know who you are. So you start with a rough-edged, authentic person who gets angry. But you work with that and say, well, okay, I don't want to be that way. I see it, I accept it, but I don't want to be that way. And now you can actually change it. Whereas if you just fake it till you make it, generally you don't make it. All you do is fake it. Because if you could have made it, you would have just made it in the first place. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't use your intellect to direct good behavior. It is civilizing to other people, and it can help you make it. It can help you get rid of things, but you can't just do that. You can't just fake it. If you're faking it, you have to also be working on making it. You can't just fake it to get by. That's the problem. And a lot of times, people who fake it eventually convince themselves that it's real. I am a kind person. Look, see all these things I've done. I'm obviously a kind person. And they start to believe it. Well, now they're farther away from actually being kind than they were before they did all those good deeds, because now they've convinced themselves that they are kind when really they're not. You see, that's a worse place. Now you're a step away from being authentic. You're less authentic. You're captured by your own lies. You start to believe your own, your own stories. So that's kind of how all that works out.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you.
Eric, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Donna. Hello, Tom.
Hello, Eric.
Let me just grab my questions. So I have some questions on the helpfulness of intellectually understanding the nature of reality. So on the one hand, I've heard you say that you are helping people to understand the nature of reality, because if we understand the nature of the game, we're much better at playing it. On the other hand, I've also heard you say that it's not helpful to give people an intellectual understanding of how reality works, because then they start acting and they start trying to game the system. So there seems to be a discrepancy here. Could you shed some light on that?
Well, if you're talking to an individual, a individual, not lots of individuals at once, but when you're talking to a single person, then you can pretty much say what you think is optimal for that person to take in and work with. So if you think that they are, going to game the system, then you don't lead them in that kind of a space where you help them game the system. So one-on-one, that's easy. When you talk to a crowd of, 50 people, and then when it goes up on YouTube and you're talking to a crowd of, 20,000 people, you just can't do that. You have to say things when you write a book, and, 50,000 people will read your book. Then you have to say things that give people an understanding of both sides of it. So you explain to them that gaming the system isn't going to help them grow up, just like we talked with Lewis about that, acting it isn't being it, and acting it doesn't help you grow up. It just leaves you in a worse position after a long time. It may be helpful in the short run, but it can be more detrimental in the long run. So you have to tell people that. And at the same time, you have to explain them, what the game is about and what they should be doing. And, so you have to give them the whole picture so that the individuals can find themselves in that picture and then apply it to themselves as best they can. So that's why there seems to be kind of an inconsistency there, is that I'm talking to lots of people, and these people are all over the place, from extremely, self-focused and self-centered to extremely not self-centered. They run the whole gamut, and you have to say something that everybody can look at it, kind of find themselves on it, and move forward with it so that it's helpful to everyone. And the best way to do that is just to explain the whole thing. So yes, it can be confusing, because now somebody comes to this work and they look at it or they read the book and they have a problem maybe finding themselves in that description, because I've talked about all kinds of people at all sorts of levels, and they have to find where they fit into that. Where am I in this? Am I very self-centered, a little self-centered, not self-centered at all? Really, where am I? And that's a difficult thing to do, because mostly you have no idea what your fears are. You've got all sorts of fears, but they're buried, and they've always been buried. And to say, oh, well, okay, I have these fears and that fears. Well, it's not like that. Those fears aren't necessarily intellectual. You don't know about them from the intellect. They're just there at a deep level. So finding yourself in that picture requires a lot of trial and error to see what fits. And I try to give people hints like, well, just look at your emotions, look at your feelings. You know, do you ever get upset? Do you ever get angry? Do you ever get annoyed? Do you ever feel, unhappy and lost? And, well, these are all negative things. And look at your emotions. And if your emotions have negative aspects to them, then you know that's fear. You have things to learn. You have to outgrow that, and you can work on that. So then that kind of gives everybody a gauge of kind of where they are on the fear list. Now, you may get a person who is very intellectual, lives out of their heads, doesn't really allow emotion much of a play in their life, keeps all that emotional stuff at a distance. Emotions, back those off. They even try to make their emotions intellectual. They justify every emotion, not as an emotion, but as, of course, I had to act that way. That's just the way people should act. They should get angry when that happens. So they justify every emotion. And people like that will have a harder time growing up. That's the left brain dominant individual. This is a hard road for them to hoe, because it's not naturally the way they deal with things. They deal with things just from the intellect. And that intellect's good at justifying whatever it is they do. So it's particularly hard for them to find their fears, deal with them, understand their feelings and emotions, and kind of accept them as they are, see bigger pictures. Those are all a little hard for people who are very left brain dominant. If you're right brain and you're very much an emotive, feeling, big picture kind of person, then you have a little bit of the opposite viewpoint. The feelings and the connections are all perfectly clear, but it's hard for you to get your arms around them and really understand what's doing what to what. It's all this confusing mishmash of feelings and stuff, and it's hard for you to work with it. In other words, you need that intellect to help you organize it so that you can deal with it and you can overcome it. So if you're extreme at both ends, you're at a disadvantage, because it takes both of those. You have to be able to be enough in the intuitive side that you don't dismiss all that intuitive stuff, those feelings. You don't just justify them. All right, let me get my intellect going here. And okay, I've figured it out. I'm right and you're wrong. I can see that. Now you need to change. See, that's what your intellect will always tell you. It'll always tell you that you're right, you're wise, they're wrong, they're messed up, they need to change. So, you have to have enough of both sides to be able to work through this. So people who are very, left brain dominant, they need to develop some of that intuitive side and some of those feelings, and try to appreciate other, and try to constrain a little bit their intellectual justification for everything. Make everything rational, whether it is or not. If it's not rational, we'll pretend that it is. Well, if you're upset, then that's irrational. So you're irrational. So obviously you're wrong, because everybody knows irrational is wrong and rational is right. You see, so we can just makes the world real simple, but it isn't very productive for growing up. So you need to, the growing up is to basically, grab hold of both sides of it. Let people be how they are. Say, okay, maybe you are irrational, but I want to have a relationship with you, so I'll need to just accept that you are that way, and learn to work with it, deal with it, and let it be positive, not negative. I can expect it. Whereas somebody who's very rational, they have the inclination to fix it. Oh, I'll tell you what's wrong. Here's what's wrong with your viewpoint, and you tell people what's wrong with their viewpoint. See, that's not helpful, because from them, that's not useful for them. They can't deal with that. They're in an intuitive space now. So you have to let people be who they are and how they are, and learn to care for them and be positive with them, love them, connect with them, help them, without trying to fix them, without trying to fix that irrationality that's causing them all those problems. You see,
So-
that's a trap that rational people get themselves into. So it is a hard thing. Yes, it's hard to find yourself. It's hard to place yourself. It's hard to know what to do. So you do it trial and error, a little bit at a time. Go ahead.
Would it be a good summary to say that because you provide people with an intellectual model of reality, so would it be accurate to say that that is useful to people to the extent that they're ready, and so that maybe there's a group of people that aren't really evolved enough at the being level, that it's not useful for them to have that, whereas people who are ready, for them it is useful? So it kind of depends on the readiness of the individual.
Well, sure. What you can learn from what you read has a lot to do with who you are, not just what's written down. It's who you are. Now, I wrote my big toe, as you've probably heard me say, as an on-ramp for intellectuals, for an on-ramp for the left brain dominant people, because they didn't have an on-ramp. The people over on the intuitive side, you can go to the bookshelf and find 100 books there that basically boil down to just ideas, concepts, but it's poetry. None of it is particularly rational. And the left brainers look at that and say, I can't deal with this because I don't see any facts anywhere. It's just stuff. Everybody's saying, well, this is how it is, and that's how it is, and you should feel this way or that way, but I can't use that because I don't see any logic in it. I don't see the necessity for it. So the people who are not left brain dominant have lots of on-ramps, okay? But what they don't have is an on-ramp to being more balanced themselves. They don't have an on-ramp to that intellectual space. And they need that intellectual space. They need something that will help them see that space as well. Both sides kind of need an on-ramp to the space. So they have lots of on-ramps to the big ideas, but to apply them in their life and to change themselves and to grow up, well, it needs a combination of both. You need to have an intellect and an awareness, and you need to have intuition. So, yes, it has a lot to do with what you're ready for. Some people are ready to sit down and pick up the Bhagavad Gita and get a lot out of it. Other people will sit down and look at that and say, what's this about? Guy on a chariot fighting a war? Going off on all kinds of, stuff that doesn't seem to mean anything, and the book is useless to them. They can't get anything out of it. Well, they're not ready for that book yet. It's poetry that they can't decipher, that they can't understand. They don't have enough experience at the intuitive level to actually understand what's going on. And then, of course, there's the opposite side. There's a lot of people who just can't read my big toe, because my big toe is laid out as logical process. Here's how things work. Because of this, takes you here. The whole book kind of starts at the beginning and develops this picture logically. I have any number of friends, good friends, that they've tried 2 or 3 times and they just can't get through it. It's just too hard. You know, it's like I've read that paragraph 6 times and I still don't have any idea what it means. You know, they just don't get it. Just like the person reading the Bhagavad Gita can read that paragraph 6 times and they don't have any idea what it means. It's the same thing. So you have people from both sides. And my book is really aimed at the left brain dominant person, and they find it easier to read, and they can get most of it. People who are very right brain dominant struggle with it. It's a little more difficult. And when they read it, they'll read it and they'll say, what, all those 10 pages and it was just this? You know, they have a, you know, intuitively they can get there, but they don't actually see the logic in it. If you talk to them about it, they can, oh yeah, well, I got that and I got that, but they don't really see where the words in my book, you know, lead them to that. That's the very right brain people. So yes, it does. It matters a lot on who you are, where you are, how you process information, how much fear you have, how easy or hard it is for you to appreciate other people and let them be however they are. You know, not try to fix them. It's not try to manipulate them. It's that's just growing up. Growing up is not an easy thing to do. If it were, we'd all be grown up now. You know, we've been working on it for 200,000 years. You know, we'd be really grown up if it were simple. It's not. It's a struggle. You really do have to pull yourself up with the bootstraps, and there isn't any other way around it. And you make a lot of mistakes as you go. And growing up means that you realize it's a mistake. Not at the time you make it, but shortly thereafter, you go, oh, I see. All right. I keep trying to fix that person. I keep trying to do this or that. You know, I keep trying to show them where their irrationality causes them problems. Well, irrationality is not a problem for them. It's a problem. Their irrationality is a problem for you. Well, you can't fix that problem by changing them. That's the way they are. You have to fix it by making irrationality not a problem for you. Understand, people are like that. Okay, from your viewpoint, they're irrational. That's okay. Let them be irrational. Learn to get along with that irrationality, to work with it, to care for it, you know, to love it even, you know, just the way they are. It's the way they see the world. And what will surprise you is eventually you'll start becoming a little more irrational yourself. It'll maybe scare you a little bit, I don't know. But it's a good thing, because once you actually grow up, you're both. You're very intuitive, which is irrational, and you also can be very logical, very rational. And you need to be both of those almost to an extreme in both cases. And you realize that everybody's on their own path trying to get to that point, and some start very much on the intuitive side, and others start very much on the intellectual side. And our cultures tend to drive people more to the intellectual side. That's just our culture, because we reward intellectual pursuits and we don't reward intuitive pursuits. So intuitive people, you know, are not going to get the attaboys and the better salaries and the more respect. The intellectuals get that. Oh yeah, they're intellectuals. They're the smart people. You see, so our culture has a bias toward the intellect. And that's not good for those of us who are intellectual, because then we start to believe that we are superior. That is the way to be. And that those people who aren't that way need to figure it out and become that way, because that's the right way to be, because, you know, the culture helps us get into that self-centeredness about how we are. That's unfortunate. But we need to realize that those intuitive people have some skills that we don't have. And we need to appreciate that their viewpoints on things, though we don't necessarily make sense of them, we can't figure them out in a logical process. That doesn't mean they aren't meaningful and they aren't valid, and that you should not work with them as they are and let them be. Just because it's not your way or our way doesn't mean it's wrong or bad. You see, instead of us trying to fix them, we maybe need to understand them better, so we can feel that emotion and those feelings and that perspective and actually see the rightness in it, see the value in it. Okay. And that's hard for a left-brain person to see that value in it, because we judge value based on how logical it is. You see? Well, that's not the only measure of value. There's other measures of value besides how logical it is. There's values of, how functional is it? Just in life and relationship and getting along. So that's a problem. People who are very intellectually dominant tend to be arrogant because they think they know everything and everything needs to be their way. And the people who aren't very intellectual, they need to be fixed, or they need to be brushed off. Go grow up and come back when you understand things. I can't deal with you like this. You need to be intellectual like me. Otherwise, I just can't deal with you. You be like me or go away. Kind of what we tell people. That's very arrogant. And the people who are intuitive, they can't explain why they feel that way. They can't explain why they know that. They can't explain why they had to do this thing or do that thing or say this or say that. But it doesn't mean, because they can't explain it, doesn't mean that it's wrong, that it was a bad thing to say, that there's some problem with it, which we left-brainers tend to jump to that conclusion. Well, if you can't explain it, then it must not be very important or must not be significant, because anything significant is logical, and anything is not logical is not significant. That's just arrogance. And of course, they have some arrogance from their side, because it's like they just can't make you understand. For some reason, you're just too thick to get it. And they keep trying to tell you this feeling and why it's important. And you just, it's like talking to a rock, you just can't get it. So they also have some arrogance in the sense that, you left-brain people are just really thick-headed. You can't understand, the things that I understand and the way I feel and why that's significant. So yes, these two groups of people have a hard time getting along sometimes. And it's particularly problematical when one of those groups tends to be male and the other one of those groups tends to be female. That makes it even harder to get along sometimes. But logic-centered tends to get arrogant, more so than intuition-centered. Intuition-centered tends to get frustrated more than arrogant, because they can't seem to get their feelings across, or their feelings don't seem to matter. You see, so they get very frustrated because the other person just doesn't understand the significance of their feeling. They're looking at the rationality of the feeling, the explanation of the feeling, and that's not where the significance is. The significance is the feeling. You see, so yes, communications are, a hard thing. Growing up is a hard thing. And it is easy to get confused. But that's, like I say, if growing up was easy, we would have been grown up, 100,000 years ago. Growing up isn't easy. We struggle and struggle and struggle. And if we make just a little tiny increment of process, wow, that's good. Then we tend to sink back and lose that little bit of progress after a while. Then maybe we earn it back again. Oh, good, I got it back again. And then we lose it. And it's not until about the 10th time you get it that you actually really get it, and you hold on to it. I mean, it's a struggle growing up. So I probably answered a lot more than what you asked, but I did that with Lewis too. But I thought it's a thing that really probably 80% of the people out there are going to listen to this. It's something that affects their life. You know, this is life. These are the conflicts. These are the issues that people have. These are the problems in relationship and connecting with other people that we have. So the better we understand that, you know, that's an important thing. So I tend to give very long answers on things that I think are very important to a lot of people.
Yeah, that was really valuable, and I can relate to a lot of it. Being in a relationship with a right-brained woman, I'm very good at arguing my case and convincing everyone why I'm right and why I did the right thing, even though it wasn't. And and she's kind of the opposite, but oftentimes she is actually right, and I need to help her explain why she's right.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you just have to recognize she doesn't need an explanation.
Yeah.
She doesn't need to know why she's right. She knows she's right. She knows she's got a point, but she just can't get that point to you because you only look at the intellectual side of it and the logical side of it, and you're missing the intuitive side of it. And she can't get you to see that side. And that then leads to frustration, which tends to lead to anger and, you know, other things that are not nice. So, yeah, that's pretty typical. That's the way it works. And we intellectuals have the one extra step, which is we try to fix those people who aren't intellectuals. We try to explain to them. We try to help them see the logical, you know, the irrationality of their position. And we're constantly trying to educate them and help them and fix them. Whereas, I guess good for us intellectuals, the intuitive people really don't try to fix us because they have no idea how to do that, and they know they have no idea how to do that. We intellectuals think we know how to do everything because everything needs to be intellectual and logical. They know that they don't know how to do everything, and they have no idea how to get through to us to let us know that their feeling is important, even if it's irrational. It's important and needs to be dealt with just as it is. So you have to realize that there's a part of the world that is not rational. A big part of the world, probably the biggest part of the world, is not rational. And you have to deal with it in that way. You have to deal with that irrationality, not by trying to fix it or putting it down, but by just dealing with it because it's there. And it's important. A significant part of our life is irrational. And the fact is that we people who are left brain dominant and think we're so rational, awful lot of what we do is irrational too. But we're just good at justifying it rationally. There's a lot of us that are just as irrational as they are, but they can't justify their irrationality as rationality. And we logical types, we can justify anything. You know, if it's the way we feel, we can justify it. We're good at, yes, arguments and you know, convincing ourselves and others. Oh, you know, give me a jury and I'd win this case. You know, I could explain people why it is that I'm right. But the point is that a lot of our world is not logical, and we need to accept it and deal with it that way. And a lot of our own behavior is not logical, and we also need to see that too. We also have feelings and emotions and things that are not rational. All we're doing is justifying them. We're rationalizing them to ourselves. Because we have to do that because we're rational. We have to rationalize everything. So we are irrational people pretending to be rational always. So look at it from the person who is right brain, and they're constantly talking to people who are also irrational, but they can't get through to them. It's like they can't break down that barrier of having to rationalize everything. They want to function on a feeling level. this is the way I feel. And instead of the other person saying, well, okay, let's work with that feeling, the other person says, oh, that feeling's not rational. You need to get over it. You see? So that's the problem. But most of our life, and often the biggest part of it, like I said, once you kind of get both the rational and the irrational developed well, you tend to live most of your life not in the intellectual side, because the stuff that's really most important isn't there. That's mostly the stuff. But you have to be rational or it's hard to learn. So you need both. You really need both. Yeah, without that rational side, trying to see the patterns and grow up is a hard thing to do. And when you're too rational, when you're locked into everything's rational, then it's hard to see the feeling side and to deal with it in that space without wanting to fix it and throw it away because it isn't rational. You have to deal with irrationality. Most of your world is going to be in that intuitive side of consciousness. There's very little actually that we ever do or think that is logical. We're not nearly as logical as we think we are. Most of that way that we see ourselves as being rational is just us justifying it, making us right and somebody else wrong, because that's the way we need to be. We need to be right. So when we're in a disagreement, we need them to be wrong. And we can always figure out a good way to explain why that's the case. But that's not helpful to learning and growing. That's a trap. You need to listen and feel, not just think. We need to listen and feel and care about somebody's feelings just because they feel them. Whether the feelings are rational or not is irrelevant. They're feeling those feelings, and that's important. We make rationality a thing you have to have before you're even willing to deal with it. Well, I can't deal with that. It's irrational. No, you need to deal with that. It's a feeling. Feelings are real. Rational or irrational is not important. It's a person, and that person has a feeling. And that person is important. So that feeling's important. Whether that feeling's rational or not is not all that important. Certainly not in the short picture, in the short time. Tom Campbell here. INMBT Events. Hope you liked this video. We now have well over 1,000 hours of free video on this user-friendly, ad-free YouTube channel. Though these videos are free to our viewers, they represent many thousands of hours in production and editing, and many thousands of dollars invested in video and audio equipment, along with the required computers and software to store and process the raw video into finished products. So far, all of this content has been funded directly out of our own pockets. Be assured, we will always continue to do what we can. It's our life, our purpose, a labor of love that we will continue to pursue as best we can. However, those pockets are not as deep as they used to be. Thus, we are now seeking to augment our resources with support from our viewers. If you find something of significant value in our videos, please consider supporting their production through our Patreon account or through a one-time donation. The links are in the description below. Thank you.